first I tried to give an overview as what generics are all about. What do you expect from generics? What are the things that we have to look into as far as generics are concerned? And let's give you a flavor as to what the pros and cons of generics are in terms of some data that we have been able to generate from India and some of the published literature as far as these generics are concerned. So by definition, a generic is a copy of the original and interchangeable with the innovator drug. So practically there's no difference in what the original and the generic is. So, and it is manufactured without a license from the innovator company, or it is marketed after expiry of a patent or other exclusive rights. So this would broadly encompass the definition of a generic. It is also important to understand what is bioequivalence, because it is purely based on this bioequivalence that generics come into the market for use among patients. So you have some amount of an active, or the same amount of the active ingredient present in the generic. It is manufactured under the same stringent conditions, and there are many generics that have different inactive. One should understand there are many inactive ingredients, such as the coating of the tablet, or the binders that are used, or the fillers that are used, and these could be different from the innovator molecule. So one has to pay attention to these aspects when actually one is using the generic, because there is a possibility that one can be allergic to any of these ingredients, and that can produce a response which may not be desirable, or at times an allergic response, or some sort of could be sometimes, like such as if you have gluten intolerance, you could have the problems related to that when you take these medications. So what are the requirements as far as generic drugs are concerned? So we know that it should have the active ingredient, of course, that goes without saying. It should be used in the same route of administration. So you can't have, even though the molecule is the same, you can't have one as an IV preparation and other as an oral preparation, and the innovator being the oral preparation. You should have the same dosage form, and it should be of the same strength, and one should have the same conditions for its use. So if all these are satisfied, one would be willing to accept that generic is closest to the innovator brand. There are, as you know, there are various pathways before a drug approval comes through, before it can be used in human subjects. So always the innovator has the hard thing to do as far as approvals are concerned. So when we look at approvals for a new drug which comes to the market, you have to look at the chemistry of the drug, you have to look at the manufacturing, you have to look at the controls, you have to look at how it can be labeled, what are the indications, and what are the testings that you have to do. Then you have to implement the use of these drugs into animal studies, look at its distribution, biodistribution, the dynamic pharmacodynamics, etc. And then comes into clinical use, and then you look at the bioavailability of this drug in the subjects. A tall order and a very lengthy procedure and an extremely expensive process. So when we look on the right side of the table, you will see that about 60% of these are what the generics also have to go through, but one of the major aspects what generic doesn't have to go through is the clinical trials. As long as you can establish the bioequivalence of the drug, it is valid for use in the human subject. So a very big aspect of approving the drug is taken care of, is not utilized when we approve generics. Of course, quality is the key. So when you are in the manufacturing of a generic, the three concepts of quality, safety, and efficacy apply very stringently. And it would also be a fallacy to believe that the quality of the production may not be up to the mark. And it is also important to believe that it is not a cheap endeavor also to bring out a generic, but when you compare it with the innovator brand, it certainly is far cheaper. So what are the costs that goes into development of an innovator brand? So you have the production, the quality control, which contributes about 56%. You have administration of the drug, 11%, marketing, 37%, the research and development, which 22%. So many things that goes into play. And many of these are utilized by the generics also, but the high drug prices that are associated with the innovator brand are because the costs involved in bringing out the drugs is so huge that they have to recover the costs. So it is bound to be expensive. Because, and the other aspect one, which was from the Tufts Center, a research which went into was that an average time taken for a drug to come into the market is as high as 14 years, and almost $800 million are spent into the discovery of a single drug before it can be brought to the public. And compared to that, a copy drug, or what we call as a generic, would be less than $1 million. So huge. So the potential difference between a generic and a branded drug, what are the potential differences? So one has to look at the quality of the raw material that is used to make these drugs. The raw materials can be more than 50% of the industrial cost of a generic drug, and the pricing pressures may cause the manufacturer to target lower quality, and these aspects have to be taken care, and that can produce an inferior generic drug. The method of synthesis of the drug is also important. So there is a risk for toxicity if the degradation products or impurities are there in the generics. And this is an important aspect of toxicity that is, and this was one study which was offhand done at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, did look at several brands of docetaxel, which is another oncology drug that is used for treating solid tumors, and the amount of impurities that were there in those brands was phenomenal as compared to the innovator brand. And for some reason, this did not come fully into vogue, but it was published in one of the reputed journals as a factor that has to be looked into when looking at the quality of generics when being used into human subjects. Then, of course, one has to look at the packaging and the stability evaluation. Many a time, the drug may be used in plastic containers. There can be interactions with the plastic containers, and the integrity of the drug may be compromised under some situations. And this could also be contributed by the environmental factors, because what is true in one place may not be true in the other place, and so there could be subtle problems that may emerge, which can result in toxicity for the patient. So there are concerns as far as generics are concerned. So there's always a feeling that, are generics safe? Is their quality as good as the corresponding brand? And is the doctor wise in switching branded drugs to a generic drug? And are generics as effective as the innovator brand? Because there is no head-to-head comparison between these, the innovator brand, most of the time, one can never have an answer to this. And coupled with the fact that there are multiple generics for one single innovator brand does not help the cause. So are generics safe? Well, probably yes, and they may be as per the standards of the innovator brand, but you can say that with conviction only if you live in a country which has strict regulatory control of the medicine. Otherwise, it is difficult to say that off the cuff that everything is okay. So is the doctor wise in switching from a branded to a generic? There are many factors that come into play. Broadly, one would say that if you're doing well with one drug, do not change. But there is no clear-cut answer because there are many other factors that come into play. One is some doctors are reluctant to switch from a branded drug. Fine, that's good. But there may be other pressures that come into play. For example, the budget for a prescription may be far more than what can be is allocated for that particular individual, and sometimes the pharmacist will be under pressure to substitute a generic for a branded for the innovator brand. So are generics as effective as a newer medically innovated or more costly drug? This is the most difficult question to answer, but most important is what you look from the patient's perspective. So this is where there is a conflict between the best medicine and the saving of money that arises. It's because innovative drugs are never cheap, and they are a result of costly research and development with a high risk of product failure before it can be proven to be safe. So everything is inbuilt into the costing of the drug. So it is expected that the innovator brand would be costly. So how do you use a generic but only if it contains, one has to keep in mind, it contains the same active ingredient as the innovator drug. It is identical in strength, dosage, and in the route of administration. They have the same indications. It is bioequivalent. It meets the same batch requirements for strength, purity, and quality. And it manufactured under the same strict, stringent conditions of GMP required for innovator products. So what is the reality that you face? Lots of concerns again. Most countries do not have a strict mechanism for approval process. And there's no formal study looking into the efficacy of leave alone comparing it with the innovator brand. And whatever data is available is through individual centers or institutions that have made the effort to look into the efficacy of these drugs. So one can never be sure, and because of the pressure to be requiring the drug because of the number of patients that are available and the number of patients that need to use these drugs, there is always always cutting corners to bring the drug in for being accessible to the patient. So this was, I mean, for a brief period, this fact was there, even in India, before the GPAP program really kicked off, before Gleevec could be made available to most of our patients, and it's definitely a fantastic endeavor that has materialized for the patients, and we see most of our patients alive because of that cause. Now, at that time, there was a period when we did not have many of the drugs. So what we did was, that was a time when the generics, imatinib or VNAT, which was produced by Natco, came into picture. So we could use those drugs. We were under pressure to use those drugs because we have the data showing such fantastic results for CML patients, and we use those drugs. But if we had access to the innovator brand before, maybe it would not have come into process so quickly as it did at that time. So let us look at imatinib. So if you look at a survey in 2013, there were 55 countries which had all the innovator brands, and there were about 14 countries with both the original and the copies. And India was one of the pioneers for generics, and it was introduced 8 years ago, maybe a little more because we started using imatinib maybe in 2004. This was a chart. The ones in red are the ones that have both the innovator brand and the generics available. So if you look at the population, which is 6 billion, you are looking at the load of CML patients. About 60% of the CML loads come from the Asia Pacific region. Of course, Australia is an outlier over there, but 60% of the CML patients come from this region. So there is a need for for availability for more drugs to these patients, and many of them cannot access the innovative or are not capable or not covered by insurance policies. So FDA, let's look at the case of India. Gleevec was approved FDA in 2001. Glee was launched in India in 2001. It cost about $2,500 per month and 36,000, way beyond the reach of the common man. And if you look at the GNI per capita, it's about $1,000. So if you looked at 2002, the GPAP program came into play, and only a few centers in country with a greater than 1 billion population had access to the GPAP program. So at that point was the launch of the generic imatinib, which came, and naturally everybody lapped into it to use it. And because of the use of imatinib, one gained experience with the use of VNAT also in CML patients. And they also had an access program which they could not sustain like the GPAP program, but they did have an access program at that time too. So this prompted a report in NEJM say that you make trips to India for getting the generics and also maybe access the GPAP program so that you can get access to the innovator brand. So we also know that 84% of the generics come from India, and they supply AIDS drugs that Doctors Without Borders use almost exclusively all the generics from India. So after a patent dismissal, many Indian pharmaceuticals have now started manufacturing imatinib, and the crystalline form polyforms of imatinib are used. And the most stable form, of course, is the beta form. And we have almost 8 companies which are manufacturing the beta crystalline form. So if you look at the cost comparison, as against $2,500, it's about $80 per month for the generic. And if you look at the production cost, it is about $30 per month. So we have almost close to 30,000 people with CML registered with CML in India, of which 20,000 are on the GPAP program and about 10,000 on generics. So if you look at the exports of generics from India, now it is also spreading its tentacles to Europe. You have first initially to the neighboring countries and then several to Africa, and you have many generics coming from Latin America also, which supplies the African subcontinent. So now let's look at the cons of this thing. There have been several reports of adverse. I got it. I'm just finishing. Yeah. So when you look at the failure rates in imatinib, there have been many reports, case series, etc., which have shown that imatinib, the generic, did not work as well as we do. We do not know whether it is a matter of chance, but we do have those reports, and these are all reports that have shown the generic imatinib in poor light. And of course, there have been some reports where many of them were the alpha crystalline form, which is not as stable as the beta crystalline form, and so probably that was one of the reasons. But we do have reports saying that it did not do well, and it gave bad publicity to the generics in the West. But we do also have reports from the subcontinent, which looked at hematological and molecular response to generic imatinibs, which showed clearly that not a small study, a significant number of papers that indicated that the achievement of hematological and molecular responses are acceptably good, and therefore its efficacy is comparable to the innovator brand. So we also have the same thing coming from with regards to certain other studies which is published from Europe also, which looked at the bioequivalence of the drug, and they concluded that it was probably equally efficacious. So what do you have as the Indian data is concerned? We have 2 studies, one from my own center at Tata Memorial and the other from Postgraduate Institute Chandigarh. So first I will look at the Postgraduate Institute Chandigarh report. So there were 719 patients, 618 in chronic phase. And if you look at the major cytogenetic response, even though the major cytogenetic response in most of the patients were a little bit delayed, they did reach there. And if you look at between the 2 generics and Gleevec, it was pretty much the same. In fact, slightly better for Gleevec. We do not know why. I mean, better for the generic. Then You looked at the experience from Tata Memorial. We looked at 1,157 patients, and about 380 of them were on generics. And when you looked at the cytogenetic response, again, equivalent. There was no difference. But we did not have any data on the molecular responses because our tests were not standardized at that point. So in conclusion, most patients in developing countries present with late chronic phase, and generic imatinib is manufactured in India, in Latin America. Generic imatinib is available in the 3 crystalline forms, and both alpha and beta crystalline forms are being marketed. If you looked at the adverse profile, which was not very adequately documented, but whatever we could gather, there was not much of a difference. So there is definitely one thing that will put the generics in terms of usage on the top is, again, the most important thing, which is the cost factor, which will make many patients use. And let me tell you that even when we look at funding these patients or trying to, when the patients are funded by their own company or from the public sector, even then, when we are writing the generics, there is an approval committee which, when you're writing the original brand, there's an approval committee which will override you and write and ask for the generic to be given, because there are a lot of these issues also which come into play when we are writing innovator versus a generic brand. And this is from the doctor's perspective that we see. So it is not easy, but there is data to say, some comfort to say that, okay, generics may, as far as CML is concerned, generics does work. But we need to go through a stringent process before you can actually gain the confidence to use generics. We got the confidence by default because we had to use those drugs at that point of time, and so it has become a matter of choice whether you want to use a generic or whether you want to use the innovator brand when we are confronted with a patient with imatinib. So we do counsel the patients about the pros and cons and the uncertainties, and then allow the patient also to decide as far as these things are concerned. Thank you. I'll stop here if there are questions.
Thanks. I think we have 5 minutes for the question.
So we are not losing the beauty as long as it works. Yeah.
Hi, I'm PT here, so from Malaysia. So I have a question is that you mentioned that in the monitoring, right, in the previous state where at a molecular level was not possible because of the facility limitations. So do we know that India is actually leading a study on the molecular level monitoring as of now?
Yes, we are doing this. I said that this was up till 2010. And since then, we have had proper robust. Many centers have come, including our center, which is doing routinely monitoring of molecular monitoring of CML patients. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that would be something great that everybody will be anticipating for. Thank you.
Yeah.
In 2001, imatinib came in India, but in 2003, generic came. I mean, you said there is a patent for 14 years. How did generic came in?
Yeah, they didn't follow the patent.
They didn't follow the patent. Okay, cool.
Doctor, 2 questions on the generic. You seem to be quite skeptical to answer the question whether generic is safe. But can you comment on the safety and efficacy on VNET, given it has been around for more than 10 years? The first part of the question. And second part about generic is, generally speaking, generic, how to access the generic? Are they available only with doctor's prescription, or they can be purchased via mail order?
They are available only on doctor's prescription, but it's freely available. Freely available, yeah. And what's your first question? I'm sorry.
The safety of VNET.
Safety
do we have
VNET.
Enough clinical data to establish
We
that?
have been using VNET since 2004, and don't see, and the data that I showed was over a period of 6 or 7 years, up to 2010. So, and a good measure of them, almost 88 80% of them have achieved a complete cytogenetic response. We do not have the molecular data. We have not collated. Now we have the molecular data also on these patients, but when I analyzed the data, we only looked at the side because it was very erratic. But given in the same breath, I would say that because we have had the experience of using, I don't see any difference in terms of the responses for the generic versus, when I say generic, I mean VNAT. I don't mean all the generics, because we do not use all the generics that are in our hospital, at least. Because we have the experience with VNAT, and because we have some sort of a data to support it, we use it on a regular basis. So in terms of safety, we do not see any difference. In terms of efficacy, there is apparently no difference. And in terms of long-term outcomes also, I think it's comparable.
So your conclusion is,
I would just say only for VNAT,
okay.
because I have experience with that only.
Yes. One more thing is, when you talk about the bioequivalence, talking about the route of administration and the dosage form, are we talking about basically the same thing?
When we talk about bioequivalence, it should be the same substance. It should be available. If you were to look at the absorption, the pharmacodynamics, everything should be equivalent. It should be the same way of administration. It should be prepared in the same conditions. And all these things, if they are met, then they say it's bioequivalent.
Yeah, but you talk about the bioavailability, but 2 points within bioequivalent is the dosage form and the route of administration. Are we talking about the same thing, basically?
It all is included in one. Everything is included. The route of administration, the strength of the tablet, the kind of raw material which is used, everything comes into the bioequivalence.
No, what I mean, two elements of the bioequivalence you mentioned is the dosage form and the route of administration.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about these two. Are these 2 points more or less the same, identical?
Yes, I should think so, yes.
So route of administration or dosage form, we are talking about whether...
Because unless the route of administration is the same, it cannot be classified as a generic.
So we are talking, you are talking about whether it's oral or whether it's injectable.
So if the innovator brand is an injectable, then the generic also has to be an injectable. If it is oral, it has to be an oral. So you can't cross that. You can't have the innovator brand as oral and the generic as IV. You can't have it. That's not possible. Then it doesn't fall into the definition.
We have time for last question.
Please. Doctor, I have a very curious question. Have you been able to find any difference or how compliance of patients on Gleevec and patients on VNAT?
Yeah, this is a very, we did that analysis also, which I did not put up over here. Strangely, we found that the compliance with Gleevec was not as good as the compliance with Inab. And my conclusion was that if you have to pay for your drug, then you are more responsible in taking it, rather than when you get nobody. There are no freebies. Freebies do not work. I strongly feel there should be some sort of an effort from the patient side also to be able to get those medicines, and there is a huge responsibility. It was the compliance, the loss of compliance was almost 16% for Gleevec, and it was around 7% for imatinib. For the generic. So that was something which was very revealing when we analyzed our data, but this is my conclusion, that people do not respect free drugs.
Dr. Rasa, can I have a question? One last question. Is there a difference between generics and biosimilars? And if there is, would you know if there are countries selling biosimilars? And
so when I said that's an entirely different area. Never mix up biosimilars and generics. They are not the same. So when I said generics, the substance is the same, the molecule is the same, everything is the same. That is not true for biosimilars. Biosimilars are biological products. So during the processing of a biosimilar, there can be difference in configuration, there can be difference in the molecular structure, but the fact is that in a biosimilar, the endpoint of the activity may be the same, but the molecule is not the same. So the approval procedures, everything are different from a biosimilar. It's an entirely different thing. And actually, in the last 7 to 10 years or so, there has been, or even lesser than that, there has been a huge effort to formulate guidelines for approving biosimilars and how to go about it. So they are not the same. They are completely different. Completely different. The rules and regulations for approving a biosimilar is entirely different from those for a generic.
Thanks, Doctor. I think that was a very wonderful session. A big applause.